Welcome to the Data Democracy, presented by renowned O'Reilly author Ole Olesen-Bagneux, empowered by Xenia. Make your data accessible and discoverable by anyone, anywhere, at any time.
Hi everybody, I'm Ole Olesen-Bagneux, Chief Evangelist in Xenia and the author of the Enterprise Data Catalog published by O'Reilly. On the Data Democracy, I have conversations about new trends in data and AI with pioneering data practitioners and data leaders. Today's guest is James Serra. James is a data and AI solution architect in Microsoft, and he is also the author of Deciphering Data Architectures, book published with O'Reilly, and it's hot off the press, and I wanted to talk to him about it. It's a great book. Here are my 3 takeaways from my conversation with James. First, tech companies should allow people to change position every year or second year because it simply allows for a better organizational setup if people can change and adapt to the technology that changes all the time anyway. Okay, my second takeaway, data architectures have pros and cons. And when you use an architecture, you should be aware of the cons as well. We always get hyped about the pros, but that's not what you want to, that's not the complete picture. And third, an architecture design session is a great thing. You can do it before you actually build a data architecture, and what it allows you to do is to assess the need you have and then build an architecture that fulfills that need. And unfortunately, many companies do the exact opposite, and that's not very useful. You can end up spending a lot of money on something you can't really use. Okay, enough of me talking. Let's hear what James has to say. Hi, James.
Hi, Ole.
It's a pleasure to have you on, James. Thank you for taking the time.
Sure, glad to be here.
Okay, so for our listeners, do you care to tell a little bit about your work experience, where you're based, what you do, and your background, stuff like that?
Sure. I've been in IT for almost 40 years now. It's crazy to think I started in the 80s as a COBOL programmer and how far I've come. If I wanted to talk about my whole career, we'd spend like an hour here because I've had at least 30 or 40 jobs. Even within Microsoft, I've had 8 roles in there. But I went from a coder, COBOL, Visual Basic, to eventually a DBA for a number of years, an architect. I worked for big companies, small companies, consulting companies on my own. I had a fantasy football company for a number of years and was one of the first to be building a solution on the web for that. And then eventually I got into, and it was always Microsoft technologies, SQL Server especially. And I got into the parallel data warehouse was a product Microsoft had that was on-prem, that was an MPP type of solution. And I was a consultant working on the project and met some Microsoft people there, and they said, "Hey, you interested in coming to Microsoft? We think you'd be good in this role as a technical sales professional." And I had no idea what that was, and they explained it, and I said, "Oh, you get paid to present?" And they're like, "Yeah, that's kind of what it is." So I jumped at that, got hired. That was about 10 years ago, and I've been at Microsoft except for a brief period where I left for EY. But most of that 10 years was at Microsoft. And as I said, I think I've had 7 roles and 10 different managers. But most of the roles were all in pre-sales, where my job is to educate customers early in the sales cycle, especially nowadays, talking about data architectures and the products that go along with it, because there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of technology that changes frequently. Mm-hmm. So instead of the customers trying to keep up with it, they look out for people at Microsoft like myself to help educate them.
Yeah, definitely. And you can definitely tell that you have had these kind of roles in everything you write, and we'll get back to that in a bit. But I gotta say, I'm curious, even though you explained that it's all in pre-sales or sales or whatever you prefer to call it. I would still be curious to the specific roles you've had in Microsoft, because it's just 7 different roles. That's a lot, and I know it's very normal in Microsoft to like change clients, change positions, move, and I think that's very healthy. So can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, sure. And people move at Microsoft because they tend to hire people who get bored pretty quickly
Mm.
and want to be challenged, have this growth mindset. So we're almost never asked to move. We just go and say, okay, after a year or two, it's time to move. It's just kind of the culture here. And most of the roles are not that different. They're somewhat related at the very least in there. And so when I say pre-sales, it means there's a company, they're interested in building a solution on Azure. They don't really know much about products or architectures. And so the true salespeople get involved in this opportunity. And when the customer says, well, we'd like to build a warehouse in the cloud. Oh, okay. Let me get James. He's the one that's an expert at that. And he can educate you. And I do a lot of architect design sessions and whiteboarding, and I discover and ask some questions and come up with an architecture. And then we say, okay, now these are the products that you may want to look at using based on answers I get from you, usually what kind of skill set you have. And so that's all pre-sales in the cycle of an opportunity and trying to get a customer eventually to go, yes, this is awesome. I'm going to go build a solution in Azure, in which case it switches to post-sales where they're now going to build a solution. And I've had a couple of roles at Microsoft that were on that side of it. So Microsoft Consulting Services is where they sign a contract with a customer to go and build a solution. And I've been an architecture in that part of it. So that's the kind of the post-sales. And that was helpful because in pre-sales, everything works great in theory, but when you get to post-sales, building a solution, it may not work as well as you anticipate. So I got some experience with that. And that's where I spend a lot of time with partners too, to say, hey, how did it go when you tried to implement this? Any problems on that? So you kind of get that whole scope.
Yeah, that's an important lesson to learn, right? To be on both sides of the contract before and after actually buying a product or using a product, in your case for Azure. I think that would be very relevant for a lot of salespeople in tech to have had that switch. Okay, you mentioned the architectural design session, which is kind of a segue to my next question, because I wanna get right into discussing your book. It's so great, and I have been very like just happy basically to read the chapters so far, simply because you can tell that the experience you just mentioned, you actually have that experience. So it's a very tangible, straightforward, easy read, and I like that a lot.
Thanks.
So basically, as I said in the introduction, your book is called Deciphering Data Architectures. What motivated you to write this book on data architectures?
Yeah. And as you know, writing a book is extremely hard work. It takes a lot of time in there. And
Yeah.
I had written a book 10 years before that. And I always said, I'm never going to write a book again. But then somebody came to me, a publisher, and said, would you be interested in writing a book on this topic that you talk a lot about? And at first I was hesitant, but then I thought, well, this could be fun. And it could be sort of my life's work in this book, because everything I want to write in the book is already in my head or in a blog or presentation that I've done. So it's just a giant brain dump. And then the idea that came about also because I saw so many customers who were confused about all these different data architectures, especially with new ones like data lakehouse and data mesh.
Mm-hmm.
And the book was based on a presentation I started probably 6 or 7 years ago. Just why do you have a data warehouse? Why have a data lake? And then of course that morphed into some of the architectures on there, and I kept updating it. And I thought, well, this would be a good way to help customers or even people within Microsoft to get some clarity on all these different architectures. And then when I found when I was presenting a lot on the architectures and I would talk about certain concepts, people were confused on the concepts. So then I thought, well, the book should start out with all the concepts Make sure they know what a warehouse and data lake is, along with all the other MDM and Kappa and Lambda architecture. There's so many things that I would see when I would talk to a customer that they would get confused. And so talking to customers validated when I started writing the book, because they'd ask questions. I'm like, that's in the book. That's in the book. Ooh, that's not in the book. I should probably put that in there. Because in pre-sales, you're dealing with a lot of people who are not very familiar with the technologies. I'm in Microsoft, I'm in federal, and they're even more behind, I would say, in technologies in there. And you're talking to a lot of C-level people who don't have a big technology background. So you got to explain it to them at sort of a high level that's easy to understand, which has always been, if I have to say, what's my superpower? It's taking complex subjects and making them easier to understand. And that's kind of what my blog has been for 13, 14 years. And that's the way I made the book, easy to understand. And then now that it's out, whenever I talk to a customer, I say, well, here's my book. You may find it helpful. And I get a lot of positive feedback, like, oh, I finally understand it. And so I wanted really two main reasons: to have clarity in the industry about what these topics, concepts, architectures are, and to simplify it, and to have the pros and cons of all these approaches, because a lot of the material I read was hyping an architecture or a concept, but they don't tell you what's the downside to it. Everything has the cons, and I wanted the book that talked about all the architectures, what's good about them and what may not be so good about them.
Yeah, totally. And that's just like what a good architecture book should do, right? It should not promise that there is one technology or one approach, one concept that can basically rule out all other concepts or architectures, because it's just not very serious. And one of the things I like about your book is that when you introduce a new concept, say a data lake, you very, very, very like easily explain, okay, these are the motivating reasons why this concept, this way of working with data emerged. I mean, all of the concepts you describe, all the architectures you describe, they have like a natural reason for existing. There's nothing surprising in it. But still, and I hope you can like interpret what I mean. But why this need on deciphering data architectures? What like made you use the word decipher?
Yeah, I went through a number of different titles and eventually came up with that. Because I thought I conveyed best the way to somebody can say, oh, I need to understand architectures. I need to know the trade-offs of them to be able to compare them to each other. And that was the idea too. And I tried in the book to have a history so you better understand why we have so many options out there, and to better clarify those architectures. And as I say in the book, I wish it was easy to just say, let me ask you a bunch of questions and I got a flow chart and here's the architecture based on your answers that you can exactly build, but it's just not like that. It winds up being pieces of all these architectures. So understand all the architectures, and then based on your case, you're gonna say, well, maybe I'll mainly go with this architecture, but there's pieces of maybe the data mesh and one of the principles, and I want to use that inside the lakehouse. And when I spent a couple of years doing architect design sessions every day when I was at the Microsoft Technology Center in New York, and every customer, when at the end of the day, the architecture would look at least a little different than every other customer in there and that's just because so much depends on the size, the speed, and the type of the data, and then things like, well, what's your skill set and how much money do you want to spend? All that would change. Are you migrating from another solution on there? And all that would change the final architecture in there. So the whole idea of the deciphering part was, here's all these architectures, understand them all and the concepts, and then go and build what's going to work for your use case. But you don't know what you don't know. So the idea is get familiar with these, and then you'll have enough information, hopefully, to go and build something that's going to be successful.
Yeah, I wanna dive into to the architectural design sessions, because let me be completely honest. When I see questionnaires that supports implementations of technology, I not always, but I often find those questionnaires not very precise, to be honest. It's this blend of marketing where people are trying to push technology and trying to hypnotize or amaze customers. And that's certainly not the architectural design session that you sketch up in your book. I could just everything you just said resonates very clearly in terms of the questions you have in your architecture design session. So maybe you can add a little bit of detail as to when did you invent these ADS, and what do the questions try to uncover?
Sure. And I had not done ADS as much prior to coming to Microsoft until I got that job at the MTC. And there's MTCs all around the country, and that's where any customer, I shouldn't say any, you have to be a large customer, can request Microsoft time to do an architect design session. And I was focused on data and AI, and they have people that can do all the other technologies, modern workplace and DevOps and infrastructure and security, but I'm the data and AI. And so I had to learn how to conduct an ADS. And over 2 years, I feel like I got it. And there was a lot of questions that I would commonly ask, and that's customers. And that's why I put those in the book, because a big part of the ADS is not just you getting up there and talking and whiteboarding, it's doing discovery. It's asking the customers lots of questions. And great advice I got when I first started doing the ADSs was another Microsoft coworker said, sometimes it's going to be like business therapy. And I was like, what do you mean? And he goes, you'll find out. And the fact you're getting all these people together in a room from a company who never many times worked together, and they start talking about roadblocks, and then other people from that company go, well, I've ran into that. Here's the answer and how to fix it. And, talk to this person. And you kind of sit back and just let that happen, which is one of the great things about being in person is it solves some of the problems without you really doing anything. But then the discovery piece was what was often missing from opportunities at Microsoft. This customer wants to talk about data warehousing. Well, why are they trying to build a data warehouse? I don't know. They just want to talk about it. Well, I don't want to just get there and start talking about a product and do a demo and it finds out it's not for their particular use case. So let me ask a bunch of questions. And that's the discovery part and all those questions in the book that you want to ask to guide you in that solution, which again is going to be very different. And the idea too of the ADS and whiteboarding was I'm not even going to talk about products until the very end. And that was other advice I got. Stay off the solution on there and ask all these questions. And then in the end, you have an architecture. And they could have came and said, well, we want to do it on AWS. And it would be like, okay, no problem. I'll just put the AWS products in there. And so I wasn't trying to sell them on Microsoft products, just on how can they make better business decisions with their data? How can the flow of data happen within this architecture? And then we'll talk about the Microsoft products or whatever they're currently using on there. But those questions, the whole process is so important early on, because I've been involved in architectures or a products or solutions that have been built where they didn't spend enough time discussing an architecture, and they go and they spend tens of millions of dollars and spend many months. And at the end of it, they come up with a solution that can handle the data that they need, or it's too complex or too costly and it gets abandoned. Well, if you spend some time up front reading a book and doing an ADS session and whatnot, you can hopefully avoid all those mistakes because you built something that's going to be able to handle what your use case is.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, as an enterprise architect myself for many years, I've been trained in asking similar questions, but can definitely sense the intention behind the questions. For example, how much data do you need to store? Will you use batch or interactive queries? Like all these questions they do not talk about a use case. They do not talk about a specific product. They tell you that they want to know these questions. How do you want to transport your data? How do you want to store it? How much do we want to store? How fresh does it need to be? And all that. And I think I'm also thinking of your I know your colleague and friend with Ethan Stringhold. It's a little bit the same kind of thinking here. That
Yeah.
okay, we have like data sources, data providers, and then we have data consumers, and everything that happens in between can take place in basically three, like high-level, three different ways, right? With the batch APIs and event streaming, whatever you want to call that, and like it's the intermingling of these patterns that really defines the architecture that you're building. And I definitely sense that behind it, but it was nice to see this ADS. To be honest, when I read it, the ADS part, I said, okay, this part is not interesting because I know all this. And then I just skimmed it, and then I kept skimming it, and I said, okay, these questions are a little different. They have a little more, there's a little more baked into this than I thought. And then I read it very, very carefully, and I was like, oh, this is super great.
Mhm.
So yeah, no, I was very impressed with that ADS style, and I definitely recommend it to everyone building data architecture. Okay, so moving on to the next question, you can tell, like when you read, when I read your book, when people read your book, they can tell that you've been in this game, just as you said, in 40 years. So it's really rare to see someone having been in this field for so long with practical knowledge from so many different eras of, should we just call it data and tech? And I think that is very clear to see in your book. So given like your enormous historic perspective on this, and this is not to age you, James, but I just want to, like, in all those years, what have been the most overlooked data architecture? Do you have an opinion about that, or?
It's interesting because you see historical patterns happen. And over the 40 years, you saw us go back, IT departments go back and forth between centralization and decentralization.
Mm-hmm.
And what's happening now is just a repeat of what we talked about a number of years ago with Inman and Kimball and having data marts and departments decentralized by having their own data marts, and you don't have a central storage warehouse in there. Instead, you have a logical warehouse, and I'm going, oh man, this is really the same thing, just disguised in different terminology on there. And so you see this ebb and flow, and that helps and makes me maybe cynical with some new technologies or approaches, because you go like, well, we've had these conversations before.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you got away from the hype to go like, oh, okay, it sounds great in theory, but I remember 20 years ago when we had these conversations, and this is why it turned out not to work out so well. And it's, in the end, it's interesting because it's still the same. It's still, I have all this operational data. I want to make better business decisions through reporting and dashboardings, and newer things like machine learning and OpenAI, but it's still the same concept. I need to gather all this data on that. So it's really the same stuff even after 40 years. It's just maybe easier with technology and not quicker though, because even with the faster technology, there'll just be more elaborate solutions that can do more. So it still takes a lot of time. And then the same thing like governance and cleaning the data, all of that. There's no easy button. There's no data mesh in the box that you just install and this all works.
Yeah.
And so, and all the customers, I say, you got to put a lot of time up front for cleaning the data and mastering the data and getting business requirements. All the stuff that we've been talking about for 40 years is still the same. Just the tools are different in there. But it all comes down to roles and responsibilities, and understanding what makes a project successful is not the technology, it's the people that you put in place on there. And I touch on some of that in the book. That's what I've learned over the years is, unless you pick the completely wrong technology, or like all you know is SQL Server and everything you do is going to be in SQL Server, because you don't know what you don't know again.
Yeah,
But
yeah. Some people do that.
yeah, and
Yeah.
that's again, it gets getting the right people. Get somebody who's an expert who's done all this stuff, or will go and learn all this stuff before you make a decision in there. So historically, it's really some of the times when I'm sitting there talking about a warehouse and why build a warehouse, it's like I was talking about this 20 years ago. People sometimes don't know exactly what a data warehouse is, with the benefits on that. So in the end, it's a lot of 80% of the same, but 20% of technology, which is very different, obviously.
Mm.
It's just keeping up with all the technology, but the concepts and all that are very similar.
Yeah, yeah. So more than a specific data architecture that is overlooked, it is more the fact that many different data architectures have been overlooked in many different scenarios or situations. It's more like that you would answer to this question, I guess, that people are trying. Basically, it's the cliche of if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right?
Yeah.
You wanna always try to solve the problems you have with a specific technology, and that's just the wrong approach. I mean, and I've been in so many discussions like that. Just like you, I've been trying to calm people down and say, no, this is not how it works. Anyway, that's a long story. If we
Yeah.
were to flip flop this question and have the opposite question, what has been the most hyped data architecture in the last 30 years? Because there, I think you have a specific answer, James.
Yeah, of course, it's been a data mesh, which is packaged together really nicely and has some great benefits,
Mm-hmm.
but it's very much a repeat of the Kimball Inman days, where we debated centralization versus decentralization. And again, everything sounds great in theory. And the problem I had with the hype of data mesh was they didn't talk about the cons of it. They didn't talk about the use cases for data mesh. It came across as it's and I know some people didn't intentionally do this, but people oversimplified it and then made it sound like it was an easier solution to build and it works for every use case and it's going to solve all your problems on there. But the reality is, it only is helpful for a very small number of use cases on there, and it could be very helpful in there. But people need to understand that we just shouldn't go with the latest craze and go, oh, we should build a data mesh just because everybody's talking about it. Instead, look at it and understand it, and then be aware of all the trade-offs that I talk about in my book. And if you say those trade-offs are no problem, then go for it. But 99% of the companies look at all those trade-offs and go, oh, this is not for us. And the problem, what I saw with customers, was the confusion. They would come to me and say, oh, we want to build a data mesh. And I go, so you understand what a data mesh is? Well, we think so. Okay, tell me what you think it is. And they tell me, and like, that's not a data mesh at all. Yeah. And so let me explain to you what a data mesh is. And also let me explain what the other architectures are. And then afterwards, then we can have a conversation of what's the best architecture. And in almost every case, when I talk about a data mesh, they would go, oh, I didn't know that's what it was. Yeah, that's not going to fit for our use case in there. However, they may come out with some of the principles. They may go, oh, that data is a product. We like that idea. We're going to use that building a data lakehouse, because you don't have to go, what I say, full mesh. You can take pieces of that and say, we're going to incorporate that principle of a data mesh inside of the solution we are going to build. Or maybe we've already built it. We're just going to modify it to be more data as a product because we like that concept.
Yeah, totally. And I think, I've been in a lot of conversations like that, and as well. And I read Pete Heinz Stringholz's book, Data Management at Scale, and we followed it very closely in my position prior to being chief evangelist here in Senea. And and I read the Data Mesh book in parallel, and I think it's a little bit like reading a vision in the Data Mesh book and a pragmatic reality in Pete Heinz Stringholz's book, right? It's those kind of differences, and I definitely sense you being on Pete Heinz's team there, right? Perhaps even more so because you are just like putting out very pragmatically the various data architectures. still, I would be curious to what you think of like mentioning data products. I have an illustration or a diagram in your book that I would want to ask you about. But before that, I would like to know, like, what do you think is a data product? If you have any like simple definition of that, James. I don't know if you have that.
Yeah, and Pete Hine is a colleague, and we talk frequently on air, and he's got a great book. His book came out about data mesh before it was called data mesh.
Exactly.
Yeah,
He kind of lacked the language, but he had the ideas, and so there was this very intricate interplay between those two books, right? And I was very, very, very occupied by that at the time. But anyway, I cut you off. Sorry. Apologies.
No, and we've had great conversations just about this topic. And I try to first explain there's data as a product and data as a product. And this is my definition. And most people agree with it. And John McInerney book sort of agrees with it. But you have data out as a product is the concept. And then data product is the technology solution you use to solve data as a product. And data as a product being, how can I make this data available for everybody else to use easily?
Mm-hmm.
How can I have a encapsulate it, maybe with API calls, where somebody can go and say, tell me what metadata you have. And then, oh, okay, that's good metadata. I want to make a call and get your data. So the idea is you wrap data in a way that's easy for others to use it. Mm-hmm. And that's called making it like a product on that. And then every domain has a number of products that they make available easily to others. And therefore, it makes it, as a consumer, it's very easy in theory for me to then go and say, let me look at all the data out there. Oh, okay, this is all the data, great. Let me now pull that data together for building a query or report. And so it's a way for you to advertise what kind of data you have, so everybody else in the organization knows about that data and has an easy way to use it.
Yeah. That makes total sense. And on that note, I would want to ask. I mean, and I didn't prepare you for this, but there's no like hard talk, BBC hard talk intentions here, James. So it's just a question, and like you have this figure. And to me, it's a very beautiful illustration of why your book is so clear. It's figure 12.1 in your book. So it's in chapter 12, obviously, the first one. It's called The Historical Timeline of Data Architectures. I don't know if you have your book in front of you.
Yeah, my book.
Great. I'm sitting and looking at it here. And for those watching on YouTube, this is the figure I'm talking about. So I've seen some. So I've seen, and I think this is really great, right? You have like I won't say all of your book in this diagram, but a big portion of it. Would you think, like, I've seen some diagrams floating around on LinkedIn in particular, saying that if you want to build a data mesh, you should not consider your data marts as data products. Like, that is not a data product. Haha. What do you think of that? I mean, do you 100% agree in that, or would you kind of agree in that? What's your take on the idea of a data mart as a data product?
Yeah, I would say no, it's not. Especially traditional data marts were just, you had a warehouse with all the subjects, and then a data mart would be a particular subject on there. And so with a data mesh, the idea of a product is usually I would say a traditional data mart would, if you transpose that into a data mesh, it would be a lot of products. Yeah. So a data mart itself could be one subject, but that one subject, that data mart would be more like a domain, and then within the domain there's a lot of products, data products on there. So that is one difference. And then the other is, and Pete Hine does a great job of this, is the DDD, domain-driven design, is how do you organize all that? It's by business subject matter, or business functionality. And his book is what I recommend for that to learn, and which is a very complex topic and takes some of my customers months and months to come up with all the domains on there. And in the end, they're not going to look like a data mart because they're broken out maybe by operational systems on there. And those operational systems are going to create analytical data. And so we need to organize that group of operational systems together. And that results in the domain of that analytical data, which would probably be very different than a traditional data mart on there. In the end, it could be somewhat similar, but I would say what's similar is the idea of decentralization of having all these data marts. Now we just call them domains. So in that way, they're the same, but the individual components of those are different. And then, of course, when you get into data product, the concept of being able to make an API call and get everything you need, data, metadata, lineage, security, that is very theoretical and very different from a data mart, which was the data's there. Yeah. Just a connection string you're going to go use to pull the data in there. And so the interface is also very different in there. But in some ways, it's separating out by subjects is somewhat similar to domain, but definitely the concept of decentralization in data marts is the same concept of decentralization with data products. Yeah. I get it. No, and I didn't prepare you for that question, but I had question. It. Well, thank you. Thank you. But I'm very I think you get. It's just. I really want to recommend your book. Very honestly, I think it's a very easily read book, very pragmatic, very clear. You can definitely tell the difference in data and tech books when people have actually worked with the things they're talking about or not, and you sense that from your book. And I'll say that the Figure 12.1 is a historical timeline of data warehouses, data lakes, modern data warehouse, data lakehouse, and why the data lake when it first came out failed, and why did we used to have data marts. And I talk about Kimball and Inman in the book because it's that saying, if you made mistakes in history and you don't learn about them, you're bound to repeat them. And I think that's happened with some of the data mesh was, decentralization sound great, but we did this and many years ago, and this is the problems we ran into, having extra costs and having all these teams that are doing the same thing and all have their own infrastructure. And then somebody comes along, usually a C-level person, goes, why do we have all these separate teams and separate architects and separate technologies and infrastructure? Let's save costs by centralizing it all. And that's where we kind of flip. And that's where I see where we're going again. You're going to create all these data mesh and all these domains with all have their own teams, all have their own infrastructure, and it's going to be very, very costly. And somebody's going to come along and say, we need to centralize all this, get rid of all these teams and get rid of all these separate architectures. And that's where I wanted to say, understand where we came from. So you can then question something new that comes along, whether it's data mesh or anything else, and go, oh, we went through this before. Here's what the problems we ran into before. What's going to happen to what's differently that's going to solve them? And that kind of gets to when I get into the data lake failed. And the data lakehouse is the same idea of not having a relational storage. What's different about it now? And the big difference, of course, now is Delta Lake, which I go through in the book in more detail. But that makes you go oh, okay, well, maybe this won't. And because I was very reluctant with the data lakehouse, I said, wait a minute, we're talking about getting rid of the relational databases again and relational data warehouses again. And how's this going to work? And when Delta Lake first came out, I was like, oh, okay, maybe I can see how this can work. And the technologies got better until now data lakehouse is a very volatile option for most solutions. Absolutely, I agree. And I had the same kind of skepticism. And I remember for the first time I saw the term data lakehouse, I was just like, they gotta be kidding me. But no, it made more and more sense. And I totally agree in the way you describe it. Anyway, James, I think time is running out here for our conversation. Since you are one of the first guests, if not the first, that has some
place else than just a LinkedIn profile, where can people find you? I want to highlight that.
Sure. Well, my name, jamesserra.com, is where I blog. And a lot of the things that were in the book were on my blog. And of course, blogs being something I update a couple times a month in there, I talk a lot about new products, new technologies, new features that Microsoft comes out with, or new concepts that'll come along. And as I said, I collected a lot of the blogs and expanded on that, and made my first book. And maybe my next book will be newer blog topics that come out there. So go there, and that has links to my blog, and which you can find on Amazon and whatnot. And then reach out to me. I have published my email on my site. If you have questions, happy to answer. I love getting in conversations with people about data architectures, and you can find or reach out to me on LinkedIn. And a lot of people that have read my book and had additional questions. Sometimes I say, let's get on the phone and have a conversation with them, because I want to hear and keep in touch with people who are going through the process of building an architecture and confusion that they're having. And then if it's not something that the book clears up, then maybe something in the blog will clear up. And I'm sure some other technology powered data lakehouse will come out and people will be confused, and I'll want to blog about it and talk about what that is and simplify it, and then how is that different than the other architectures that we've briefly discussed.
Yeah, sure. That you can definitely tell that you're both knowledgeable and curious, and that's a true pleasure to experience in exchanging views with you, James. So I want to thank you for coming on, and take care.
Thanks, Ole.